Hello again, and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where the US had the largest empire in history, or at least the largest influence in history. I did at least temporarily color in some of their closest allies, not including African nations, because I could not realistically tell that. Of course, we have a slightly expanded NATO with countries such as Bosnia, Sweden, and Georgia. We have their Western Pact with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Australia. And in South America, they have a good amount of influence as well. With that, let's begin. Here we have the United States. They control all American lands, all Canadian lands, the island of Greenland, the island of Iceland, northern Mexico, along with a satellite over the rest of Mexico. Influence over Nicaragua, in control of the Panama Canal, influence over Venezuela, control of all old European holdings in South America. They have the entire Caribbean, most Pacific islands, including over here in Oceania. And as I said, influence across the entire world. What's the first thing that would change here is that the Russians and the Chinese are far more, let's just say, screwed over in another war. This is a far more powerful US. We're also going to assume that they are somehow doing even better than they are in our timeline, and are even more dominant with a larger economy, etc. So let's pick a little point of divergence here, and let's use the Russians for it. The Russia-Ukrainian conflict, which we're going to assume is just about to start here. I do not even know if Russia would risk this, with such a powerful USA. This American state could easily beat the Russians or the Chinese, and it would take China a lot longer to catch up, if they even can at all, to this new American state. This US would also have complete control of the entire continents of North America and South America, influence over the entirety of Europe besides Belarus, Russia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Oh, and technically Switzerland as well, though they are very much so Western-leaning. As I said, all of South America is aligned with them. Even more of Africa, as these people have, the US now has way more money, along with their European allies, to send to Africa to gain favor, and especially far more than the Chinese could ever give. Anyway, let's continue with the first Russia-Ukrainian conflict. And I don't think this is going to go very differently from what you would expect or from how it went in our timeline. The Russians would begin an invasion into eastern Ukraine, into northern Ukraine, and in the already occupied Crimean Peninsula. This would quickly harm the country, but within days, European aid would start to come in, and after a few weeks, American aid would arrive, stalling the Russians. The Ukrainians would push back in the north and in the center. Meanwhile, the Russians would continue to push in the east. They would soon manage to capture all of eastern Ukraine and begin to push further. How are they doing so well? Well, just to make this slightly less one-sided, the Russians are somehow going to be military geniuses. Not geniuses, but they are going to be doing far better in this war. They are going to successfully get Belarus completely involved, and with China fearing the US, China is now going to be far more on Russia's side, as there is a far more dominant power in this world that needs to be put down in the eyes of almost everyone. With Belarusian entry, northern Ukraine will fall, along with a part of the east on the border with Poland. From here, this is where the major issue will happen, and that is that the Russians are struggling to get supply from itself to Kaliningrad. The Baltics and Finland have agreed to fully block off the Strait of Finland, and without any naval access, along with Lithuania blocking any access across land, the Russians are screwed. The Russians decide to ignore that and try and get some weapons over to Kaliningrad from the mainland. When Lithuania sees this, Lithuania sees it as a declaration of war. And with Lithuania being involved, of course that means that the Americans are involved too. Now I am going to be calling them in red even though they are the defenders, simply because that's the color I already put the US as, and I really don't want to change it right now. So Lithuania has now been attacked. The rest of the Baltics and all of NATO will be joining in. This is not... Also, I don't know why I didn't color in the UK at the beginning. The UK left the EU, and I kind of forgot to put down the entirety of NATO. So yeah, the UK is also in this. Don't know, I forgot to put them down in the beginning. Despite that, most of Europe is going to be joining in on this, turning this from a simple localized conflict between Russia and Ukraine into the next world war. For this scenario, we are also going to be assuming that no nukes exist, simply because if they did, then nobody would live, or at least probably 1 billion people or more would die immediately due to each side nuking each other countless times. And seeing as I don't want that, since that would completely ruin the whole war aspect of it, we're going to be ignoring the fact that nukes exist completely. So this is going to be a fully ground-based war. Okay, there we go. I believe I just got every country I had in the beginning. North Macedonia and Albania, and Moldova is also going to join in, out of fear of the Russians and Western alignment growing stronger. Immediately, Russia is going to have the upper hand, though, as they stall their attack in Ukraine in favor of a Baltic assault. Unluckily for them, even in this world, Poland has been vastly increasing their military spending, and Poland will hold them back surprisingly well. In the Baltics, however, Russia will have a much easier time as they capture all of the mainland and eventually even capture the Estonian islands. Not the biggest hit to NATO, though. Russia begins their next campaign into Finland, capturing southern Finland and even pushing into the north. But sadly, this is going to go even worse, as soon enough they are stalled by the massive Finnish reserves and morale to fight the Russians. And along the Polish front, Western troops, along with the strengthened Polish army, are now holding them back. Along with this, the Americans are starting to flood troops over to Europe. Russia knows it's a matter of time and needs to do whatever they can before that time is up. So they will be smashing their heads harder than they have ever smashed before. They begin a massive push into eastern Poland, only being stopped near the city of Warsaw. The Russians begin to encircle the city, whilst the Poles push out. I know this isn't exactly where Warsaw is, but if I put it any more southward, the Balkan reinforcements are doing it. The Polish manage to pull off somewhat of an encirclement, but it doesn't really work, as the Russians manage to evacuate most of their divisions. Now, this was Russia's last attack. They tried to capture the Polish capital and they failed, so they will be pushed back and held off. In Finland, they will continue their incredibly hard assault throughout the Finnish, forests. Yeah, cold forests. And by now, it is nearing winter time, which means that the Russians, who have historically used the winter to their advantage, are now fighting in the Nordics during the winter. You can ask the Soviets how that went last time, and although they do manage to cut off southern Finland and capture much more of the north, their assault is practically fully stalled to the full Finnish force, which may not sound like a lot, but look at those Finnish reserves, and I have seen polls of how many Finns would fight. The Russians would not win that. In Poland, they start a second push for Warsaw, but once again, they fail. Push for Kiev is their only campaign that succeeds, capturing most of Ukraine and using this as momentum to push down into the Balkans. This goes fairly well, but by now the Russians have been fully stopped. No allies are fully getting involved into this war, which means it's Russia against the world, aka the US, who has the full backing of their Asian allies, South America, Oceania. Everyone is on the American side, and if they are not on the American side, they are mainly neutral. China is supplying the Russians, India still has trade relations. They have okay relations with other countries, but it's not going to save them. Serbia abandons them, Armenia abandons them, Central Asia, to some extent, abandons them. They are on their own here, and the American army, along with all Western European armies, have now arrived and are pushing them back in Poland. The Poles, who had done, as I said, a very good job of holding back the Russians, are now being able to capture their first Russian lands in the form of Kaliningrad. This is already a fairly important push, but it is mainly going to allow for the Baltics to be reliberated. All southern Latvia, including the capital of Riga, is recaptured, along with most of Lithuania. From here, they continue their liberation campaign across Poland and even into eastern Ukraine, although not too much across the border, as their main focus here is to capitulate Belarus. To do this, they begin a full spearhead maneuver over towards Belarus' capital in Minsk. This swiftly captures the city, as Russia, whose front lines are completely collapsing everywhere, has no manpower left to protect their smaller ally. And soon enough, with the Belarusian capital and most of the nation gone, it surrenders. This leaves literally just Russia against Europe and the Americas. That's not going to go very well. With full Nordic reinforcements and American support, the Finns push the Russians back all the way to the border in the south, and further back in the north. This is becoming more and more hopeless, especially once the Nordics, getting even more support, start to push down towards St. Petersburg, one of the most major Russian cities. Once again, assuming there are no nukes to be used. From here, the Americans and Europeans finally think they've got enough of an advantage to push back into Ukraine and begin a mass encircling maneuver in eastern Ukraine, northern Romania. This goes perfectly, and all Russian troops are killed or captured. This momentum continues into the rest of eastern Ukraine and even a part of the south. At this point, the US has completely embargoed Russia. Using Japanese ports in the east, Russia is cut off. Any trade at all is coming through Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or China, nowhere else. And that completely isolates them, destroying their economy. From here, the Ukrainian push is going to go even better. Using their momentum that they've already gotten, they recapture Kiev and the majority of Ukraine. They then naval invade Crimea, using their complete control of the Black Sea, and push the Russians completely out of the peninsula, along with the rest of southern Ukraine, leaving just a part of the north and east. This northern bit, though, is going to fall very soon, as I'm just going to call it the Americans, because that's what this video is about, but they managed to kick the Russians entirely out of northern Ukraine. This is absolutely devastating. Most of their army is either deserted, died, or been captured. The Russian flanks are completely empty, and with Georgia, who hadn't been a very big participator, now having full Turkish, Greco, and Bulgarian help, along with some American, they start to push the Russians out of the Caucasus, where there's still some people who would really rather not be under Russian occupation. With this push into their south, which has a decent amount of important cities and resources, the Russians are going to be forced to pull even more troops out of Ukraine. Finland is going to continue their assault into northern Russia, capturing the railway link between Moscow and the rest of populated Russia and Karelia. And the cities such as Murmansk and this northern one, which I forgot the name of, completely cutting off all of these Russian units from any sort of communications or anything like that, as the Red Team also has full aerial support here. They rule the skies, they rule the waves, and they rule the land. They have every advantage imaginable, and they use that to crush the Russian army in the entire northern Russian army. From here, they start a re-liberation campaign in Estonia, successfully managed to free all of their allies, and for the first time since 2014, Ukraine, all of Ukraine as well. This is going to lead to the full collapse of the Russian front. Most of their troops have either deserted or been killed. The captured ones are living arguably better than they did under Russian rule, and most people, as the Americans start to arrive, may be a bit rebellious at first, but really are against Putin as well. At this point, the city of St. Petersburg falls, along with all Black Sea access, cutting off the Russians even more. With the fall of all of southern, northern Russia, they started to push along the main front. Also, this would not look this clean. There would be a lot more maneuvering, a lot more going for cities, a lot less just driving across random plains, like random fields. But I don't want to spend the next 2 hours intricately mapping out a Russian-American conflict. Soon enough, the Battle of Moscow will be happening, and given time, the Americans will win, destroy the Russian center, and use this to push their advantage even further. With this, everyone knows by now that the complete Russian demise is inevitable. Even in the East, it's possible the Americans would try something just to finish the destruction of all of Russia. Landing near the Coral Islands and near the nearby peninsula, they would make naval landings on the island of Sakhalin and near the city of Sevastopol. With the fall of the city, Eastern Russia has fallen, and the main reason for this is simply the US being sick of seeing Chinese guns out on the battlefield, as at this point that is mainly what the Russians would be using. The Americans used this advantage to capture most of the Russo-Chinese border, along with much of what's left of the Russian coast. This is once again devastating for the Russians. They can now get even less aid, and being completely cut off from the world, they will soon enough completely capitulate. I doubt their high-ranking officials would completely surrender, but they really don't stand a chance. The people are against them, the world is against them, they have no help. They would fall, and we will have a relatively fair peace go on. Kaliningrad, I don't really know what happened to it. Most people give it to Poland, but that doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It's mainly occupied by Russians. There are no Poles there. The only reason why you would give it to Poland is to make it look good on a map. Along with this, giving it to Lithuania is an even worse idea. Lithuania might get some minor territories out of Belarus around their capital city so that it is less targeted, less easy to attack. Poland might also get some regions in the area which have small Polish minorities. They might be given a small part of southern Kaliningrad, but I don't really know what would happen to it. It could just be turned into an independent state, and that is what I'm going to be doing right here for a more moderate peace treaty. Belarus would lose some lands to Ukraine, and Ukraine would take some Baltic lands from the Russians. But overall, this is nothing too extreme. This is just basically the West rewarding Ukraine for years of bloody conflict and their entire nation being completely destroyed. Ukraine, all of their infrastructure at this point is down. It's gone. They don't have anything left. Their cities have been turned to rubble at this point. Same can be said about the Russians. This has been maybe not the most devastating war, but possibly the second, just behind World War II. It really depends on how you look at it and from whose eyes. Finland would really be the person who gains the most here, taking lands near St. Petersburg mainly for strategic purposes, and lands in the north, not as much as I normally give them, because this is just Russia being the aggressor. They don't have to be punished too badly. The US would be given a lease over the Coral Islands, along with influence over this entire portion of eastern Siberia, the far, far east of Russia, where they would gain full resource rights. Along with this, Belarus would be turned into an American puppet, along with Russia being given a pro-Western government, which would join NATO and the European Union, further solidifying American control over the world. At this point, they have turned from the global policeman to the global government. Most of the world is now either under their control, or at least under their influence to some extent. In a faction with them, and in alliance with them. Africa is still pretty untouched, so is China. But overall, at this point, the US has complete dominance, and China is coming up next. With nukes gone, once again, would be a far less deadly conflict, but still like hundreds of thousands of Russians have already died. Hundreds of thousands have died in the Ukraine war alone. In a world war like this, where they reached Warsaw, although not capturing it, they reached it. A lot more would happen. Still, the U.S. just took some losses on their manpower, and with Europe being slightly weakened, and especially the Russians being significantly weakened, this is actually quite good for American global dominance, as that gives them less enemies, even if they are American-aligned, less people who they have to compete with for influence, etc. I'm going to color this out, but just remember they are in a faction, they are heavily allied. And, of course, as I mentioned as well, the Kuril Islands will be given to the U.S. at least temporarily, although the Americans would most likely just give these over to Japan, as Japan has a far greater claim to them, and the U.S. would only want them for strategic reasons to have an influence in this area, naval bases, etc., which they can just get from Japan. They may also gain control over some other Russian bases, Russian military outposts, etc., but in land alone, not much else would change. Not much at all would change, except a slightly larger Ukraine, slightly smaller Belarus, and a slightly smaller and weaker Russia. But the U.S. is not yet done. And where are they going to go next? To Taiwan. Although losing relations with China would still be absolutely devastating, it has just gotten much, much better. Once again, I am not going to draw on the entire thing. Let's just look at this. Look at American dominance here. All South and Central America, of course. That's already pretty good. They control Oceania. At this point, actually, I'm not going to give them the Philippines. I don't know who the Philippines would be aligned with here. I am going to give them Papua New Guinea, though. So they have all that. They have Japan. They have South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. They have good relations with pretty much all of Europe. Along with this, they have control over Russia. So that's already a decent portion of the world, and that's just the countries that are very much so aligned with the U.S. In Africa, most nations are at least somewhat aligned with the Americans, have good relations with the Americans. By this point, Africa would be a far more important region, and most nations here would most likely ally themselves with the Americans over the Chinese. This is just some fact that I see. India would also probably get themselves closer to the Americans, as that would lead to far better trade deals with the majority of the world, as you can see here. Even if you remove that, American dominance is still supreme, and I'm actually going to color in Belarus with this more specific American puppet government color. As well, the Russians were given a pro-Western government. Belarus is now directly under the rule of the American sphere. Along with this, the U.S. would practically go into South America and end everything, securing their dominance. Some nations would just be aligned, such as Brazil or Chile, but every nation in the Americas would now, at least to some extent, be under American dominance. This is also a slightly more realistic video than my normal one, so let me know if you prefer it or do not. Because if you do not, I will do a part 2 of this where the Americans invade the entirety of South America, Africa, and Asia. Just if that's what you prefer. If not, then let's continue with this in the slightly more realistic way. Although, the US getting this strong, not exactly the most realistic. Still, the Chinese are their last major threat, and how are they going to get to them? Well, they officially recognize Taiwan as a country and invite them to their Pacific Organization. China sees this as a completely outrageous claim and declare war on the Taiwanese government. The Americans wouldn't immediately get involved, as this is still a very tense matter inside of the Senate. Even the president, who I don't even know who would be at this point, is struggling to decide if they should join or not, but in the end, Once Japan and South Korea fully pledge themselves to the support of Taiwan and join into this war, the Americans will too. This will not call in all other American allies, as this is not a war. Oh, wow. This is not a war that was declared against the Americans, more so the Americans defending their Pacific holdings. This is also not a full world war. This is a more localized Asian war, but the Asian theater has support from the Americans. So yeah, how is this going to look for China? It's not looking great. They're at war with most of Oceania, East Asia, and of course the Americans. Judging by economy, the American side is winning. Judging by military strength, the American side is winning. Judging by almost every single metric you can use here, the American side is by far winning. So let's begin. The Chinese will manage to capitulate all of Taiwan. Sadly enough, it will happen, although it will cost multiple hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, even putting a major dent into their military, as now they are the ones cut off from global trade. They still have some localized trade deals with Pakistan or some Middle Eastern nations, some African nations as well, but Europe, Russia, and the Americas all fully embargo China and refuse to do trade with them, no matter how bad it is for their economy. Doesn't really matter either way, because the Americans get the Malaysians to agree to use Malaysian waterways to their advantage, along with Vietnam, as both want the Chinese out of their water in the South China Sea. This allows the Americans to fully set up a blockade of the Chinese coast, and that is not particularly good for the Chinese. They can no longer trade with anyone unless they are bordering, and even if they are, it's going to be very, very risky, as the U.S. is condemning any nation that trades with the Chinese. So yeah, immediately, the American economy would most likely plummet about 20% during this, maybe 40%, somewhere between there, but the Chinese economy would completely drop. If this lasted for more than 3 years, it would turn into a slug. They would have no trade, which means there's no point to making billions of toys that you can ship around if you cannot ship them. China would be absolutely doomed, although North Korea would not see the writing on the wall and would join in anyways. Simply because they have to. If they do not, they die. China would also manage to convince Laos and Cambodia, less so convinced, more so force, them to join into this war. Myanmar refuses, and they go into a semi-bloody civil war between a Chinese-backed government in the north, in the jungle, and an American-backed government near the Thai border. This would not be directly involved in this war, but it would be there. Soon enough, the Chinese would begin an invasion from North Korea down to South Korea. Would you like to see how that looks? Boop. That's all that happens. By now, the American army is in South Korea, the Japanese army is in South Korea, and due to the very heavily militarized border, that's all the Chinese can do. They pull off some major operations, especially with some hacking, and they get China, actually, one thing they have above the U.S. in this timeline, and that is simply because the U.S. has been too preoccupied to do it, is China has a better, hacking sector of their military, a cyber section of their military, and they managed to use that to crack the South Koreans and completely ruin South Korean logistics. Luckily for South Korea, the Americans will come in with their own systems and save them from being completely overrun. While this Chinese advance does manage to capture Seoul and push the South Koreans back significantly. This massive cyber attack will hurt the Chinese even more, as now occupying these lands in South Korea, every single person is killing any Chinese soldier they see. They do not care. They don't care if they die, they just want to get the Chinese out of their country. And soon enough that will happen. In most scenarios, you see people completely capitulating the South Koreans. This Korean War all over again. The South Koreans will be pushed back almost completely to Busan, very, very similarly. And then, when the Americans and other allied forces begin to arrive, including a lot of European and Russian volunteers, they push them back. They kick the Chinese completely out of South Korea, and even begin their own invasion up into North Korea. They swiftly pushed towards the Chinese border, making this look, as I said, very similar to the Korean War, except this time China isn't going to be saving North Korea, but instead falling with them. The Americans quickly managed to capture a decent portion of the northern Chinese coast, and then stage multiple attacks out from the Russian border. This is because the Russians give them full military access, and although Russia is not directly inside the war, American troops are pouring out of Russia, forcing the Chinese to fight them back there as well. Soon enough, the Americans gain a sphere of influence over all of northern China. Along with this, the Americans managed to reinvade Taiwan, and with local support, take it over. Well, re-annex it. From here, China is going to start to have some internal problems. They had been cracking down even harder ever since the start of the war, and the Xinjiang region will not have that. I know that's what the Chinese call them, but that is what they're going to be in this scenario, and they are now rising up. Along with that, Tibet is going to, at least to some extent, rise up again as well, hurting the Chinese even more. After that, democratic elements who have been brewing in the south ever since the start of the war, and even before that, rise up against the Chinese government. If you're wondering how this happened, as I mentioned, the Americans have full aerial and naval supremacy, so they start to bombard them, not necessarily with bombs, at least in the south. Beijing, Shanghai, those cities are destroyed. But they use some allied measures that didn't exactly work in World War II, but they work here, and the Chinese people have had enough of this war and of the fighting and of the oppressive government, which has gotten even worse. So they rise up, and all of southern China falls. With this, the north is destabilized, and China is having some Napoleon-esque problems. You can only hold back one front line, which means slowly but surely, as you alternate which one you want to focus on, the other one grows. Soon enough, China decides to focus entirely on their south, and manages to push back the Americans significantly, throwing away multiple millions of Chinese lives. Sadly for the Chinese, an even more bloody area will be in Tibet, where the Tibetans have the full advantage. They have the support of the people, and most importantly, they have the knowledge of the land they're in. Chinese are fighting in mountains. They do not have any help. They're going into houses and stealing the food. That will not help them at all. And at this point, the Americans are nearing the Chinese capital of Beijing. The Chinese attempt to move their capital southward, but that does not remove the significance of the Americans capturing the city and pushing into the rest of northern China. Once again, it would not look this clean, but this is just how it's going to look here. By now, all Chinese people want independence. Laos and Cambodia capitulate without losing a single bit of land, not wanting to fight in this war. And without any choice, given time, China will collapse as well. Let's look at this peace treaty, which will cement American influence in the world. First of all, Tibet and Xinjiang, of course, is going to be given their own states away from China and promised independence by the American government. Let's give Xinjiang a bit of a stronger state. Let them take over some Chinese lands. From here, Taiwan is going to be reset up as the main Chinese state. A Manchu state is going to be set up in the north. Not all of these regions are even mainly Manchurian, but they need to weaken the Chinese at least temporarily to stop them from growing. Laos and Cambodia are going to be turned into full American puppet states. Along with this new Manchu state, Korea will be reunited, and as I mentioned, pro-Western governments in Xinjiang and Tibet, Taiwan, or at least the Taiwanese government, takes over the rest. So yeah, now there are very, very few threats to American dominance. We're going to sort those out really quickly, and then I will end this with a scenario that will cement the American position in the world forever, not just as a military power, but as the hegemon of the world. This was Pax Americana at its height. Of course, to do this, they had to start off with all of Canada and influence over North America, but hey, if they had that in our world, maybe they could pull this off as well. Just gonna quickly change this all back to white, and we can see what has happened to this map, along with some smaller changes. I will just map out. It doesn't deserve its own war. Let's just put in these new American client states, including Manchuria, Laos, and Cambodia. Once again, this is just the states directly under American dominance. This is not all the states allied with the US. At this point, most of the world is, especially without China to help out anyone else. It's all American. Along with this, the US would, similar what they did with Russia, they took the Kuril Islands. They will be annexing the island of Hainan, securing their influence in the South China Sea and the Pacific as a whole. From here, they would stage rebellions in Iraq, Iran, Syria, manage to destroy the Afghanis, setting up their own government there, along with, as I mentioned, Iraq and Syria. And overall, they would finish securing their influence over the world before finally being put to rest, knowing that everyone is now American aligned, and if not, they are neutral. The Indians don't have anyone else to run to. The Europeans are still hurting from the war, and the Americans own their own 2 continents and influence over the rest. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you prefer this or more unrealistic one where the US just attacks everyone and has no allies to start with. With that, hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.